This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 425 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was kind of all over the place, but I feel like that was the case for all of fantasy football, not just the guys that I talked about on this show. The quarterback streaming choices were fine, especially Ryan Fitzpatrick, given his fourth quarter numbers. But I missed big time on Tom Brady, so the quarterback position was just kind of a wash. I was wrong about the Texans' offense for the most part too, especially Brandon Cooks. I talked about Cooks yesterday on the 10 Trend show, but that was a pretty surprising result, especially when you look at how much he was on the field. I also got the result of Jerry Jeudy wrong, but I think the process was actually fine there. He only caught 2 balls. One of them just happened to be a big touchdown. But I was right to be bullish on Mike Davis. Some of the deep plays that I noted at wide receiver did fine, considering they were waiver wire guys. T.Y. Hilton didn't do a whole lot. But most importantly, guys, Robert Bleepin Tonyan. I talked up Tonyan, Schultz, and Ebron as my 3 tight end streamers, and Ebron didn't play, Schultz did well, but Robert Tonyan was looking like Tony Gonzalez out there. That big 3 touchdown day from him, that helped me out last week too. I'd say overall, not a bad week. We're on to week 5 now. Before getting to this week's players that I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus, we've got another FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League contest, and I wanted you to know about it. It's just $5 to enter, there's $2,000 in prizes, and you can enter up to 3 lineups. To join, just go to fanduel.com/league/listenerleague. Eligibility restrictions apply. My favorite quarterback streamer this week is Teddy Bridgewater. We saw a strong outing from him last week, so we know that he's got it in him. But this week's game against Atlanta is even juicier than last week's contest. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Panthers-Falcons game has a 54.5 point over-under and just a 1.5 point spread. So the game should be close and it should be fairly high scoring. That's good news for Teddy, since Atlanta ranks dead last in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year. So I like Bridgewater a lot this week, and I'm actually playing him in a few leagues myself. Kirk Cousins is also in play. One of the things that I like about this matchup with the Seahawks is the fact that, number one, it's projected to be high scoring. FanDuel Sportsbook has this game's over-under at 57.5. That's very good. But the Vikings are also pretty big underdogs, which means they're going to be forced to throw more, or they have the potential to throw more. And they've been a pretty run-heavy team. And then there's the matchup. As I talked about on the 10 Trends episode, Seattle's given up 500 more yards to wide receivers this year than any other team. Teams are targeting wide receivers against Seattle at the highest rate in the NFL. Meanwhile, Kirk Cousins has been targeting his wide receivers at an above-average rate this year. And he's throwing it down the field 15-plus air yards at the absolute highest rate in the league. The Vikings are going to have to keep up with Russell Wilson, and that could unlock Kirk Cousins a bit. So I like him this week off the waiver wire. And then there's Justin Herbert. Similar to the Vikings, the Chargers want to be this ground and pound team. The Chargers rank dead last in neutral script pass to rush ratio. The Vikings are 31st. But they may not be able to do that against the Saints team that's been pretty good against the run over the last season or so. And one that's an 8.5 point favorite. On the year, New Orleans ranks as the 13th best matchup against quarterbacks in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. Not that that really matters, but it's not like they're on the other extreme as a super tough matchup. I like Cousins and Bridgewater more, but Herbert should be fine this week. Now, I missed out on Tom Brady last week, but I'm going to go back to him again this week as someone who I think could be benched. I'd be fine playing both Bridgewater and Cousins ahead of Tom Brady. He's got touchdown regression coming, which is what I talked about earlier this week on the 15 Transactions episode. And he's facing the Bears. Chicago ranks right now as the 5th toughest matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and this game has one of the lower over-unders on the week at 44.5. I don't love that it's a Thursday night game because of how weird those games sometimes go. But Brady, to me, is more of a mid to low end QB2 this week. And then I would not be playing Carson Wentz against Pittsburgh. Obviously, the matchup just looks tough at first glance, but on the season, Pittsburgh has by far the highest pressure rate in football. The Eagles have allowed one of the highest sack rates in the league this year too, and Wentz himself doesn't have many healthy weapons. And he's really gotten by on rushing the last couple of weeks. He still has just 2 passing touchdowns over his last 3 games. And he's averaging 209 yards per contest over those 2 games. That's not great. He just has a rushing touchdown in 3 straight contests, but that's not something that we can bank on. So I don't like Carson Wentz. It doesn't sound great for Raheem Mostert this week, which means Jerick McKinnon is a lower-end RB1 or maybe a higher-end RB2. He saw over 82% of the team's running back rushes and almost a 20% target share in Week 4 against Philadelphia. And now he's finished as at least an RB2 in every single outing this year. And now this week, McKinnon gets Miami. The Dolphins are well below average in adjusted fantasy points against, and the 49ers also have an implied team total of 27.5 points. So you should be playing him this week. I'm also into my guy Antonio Gibson. He saw a season-high 72% running back rush share last week, and that was matched with a season-high 11.4% target share. They're using him more and more. This is exactly what we wanted to happen. And that's good news against the Rams, who have been good against the pass, but they've been not great against running backs this year. They rank 16th in points allowed to the position, so they look like an average matchup. But when you adjust that for strength of opponent, that ranking jumps to 5th. So they're the 5th most advantageous matchup. Gibson is a solid RB2 this week for most teams. Now, if you need to go a little bit further than that, you could look at J.K. Dobbins. The Bengals aren't anything special against the run. They've actually allowed the 4th most running back rushing yards this year. And the Ravens are big 12.5 point favorites. If that positive game script hits, then you could see more runs, and that could be big for Dobbins since he's coming off a game where he saw his running back rush share jump back up to over 20%, while also seeing a 9% target share. He's certainly a deeper play, but I don't totally mind him if you're in a pinch. And then my ultra deep play of the week is Dontrell Hilliard. Dearness Johnson was a popular waiver ad this week. I mean, I talked about him on my 15 transactions episode, but I also talked about Hilliard. Hilliard only played 2 fewer snaps than Johnson this past week. There's this massive gap in ranking between the 2 running backs, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to see Hilliard outproduce him this week, especially given the 2 players' overall athletic profiles. The matchup's not great, and that game environment against the Colts might suck. But I at least wanted to use this opportunity to say that I think that we might be overstating the Johnson versus Hilliard dynamic. Now, on the flip side, Nyheim Hines is RB29 over on Fantasy Pros this week, and that seems high. Like I just said, I don't really love that game against the Browns just in general, with both teams being on the run-heavy side. They rank 24th and 30th in neutral script pass-to-run ratio, and both teams rank in the bottom half of the league in situation-neutral pace. So they're slow, and they like to run the football. That's not great. And Hines' peripherals aren't even that good. I mean, they're not terrible. He's averaging an 11.5% target share per game since that big week 1 outing. But he's averaged just 16% of the team's running back rushes over this time. I'd rather be playing someone like Chase Edmonds this week. And then lastly at running back, there's Rex Burkhead. Damian Harris is likely to be the early down guy in that offense. He had a good game on Monday. But James White being back in week 4 really did hurt Burkhead. In weeks 2 and 3, Burkhead had target shares of 13% and 36%. On Monday night, it was under 3%. James White, meanwhile, was at a near 23% target share. And White played 14 more snaps. Burkhead watched his snap share go from 70.8% in week 2 to 46% in week 3, all the way down to 35% this past week. He saw some red zone work, but I still wouldn't have a ton of confidence in him in this week 5 game. At least compared to where he's being ranked, which is RB32 in PPR formats. I really hope this is the week for Marquise Brown, because like I said in the 15 transactions episode, the peripherals are there. He has a 26.5% target share in the season. He ranks 7th in total air yards. It's all there. The numbers are there. With a plus matchup against a Bengals secondary that's been the 9th friendliest to opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed, I'd find a way to get Hollywood in my lineup. The big game is coming. Another 15 transactions player from this week was Darius Slayton, and I love him against the Cowboys. As I mentioned in the show, Slayton ranks in the top 20 in air yards on the year, and he's got a target share over 20%. Meanwhile, Dallas is a top 5 team that you want your wide receivers to go against. You want to play your guys against this Cowboys defense. And what should be a negative game script for the Giants given this point spread, I think Slayton should walk into a 7 or 8 target game. And against this defense, that means he could have a big day. Jamison Crowder is currently being ranked around Brandon Cooks in the high 30s. And I think it probably has to do with Joe Flacco, but I still think he's a fine play. He's ranked as the wide receiver 9 and the wide receiver 18 in his 2 games played so far this year. And Arizona, his opponent, ranks 6th in percentage of targets that have gone to the slot this year. So a good number of looks are going to that area of the field, and that's where Jamison Crowder has played 80% of his snaps this season. Maybe Flacco is like incredibly bad, but Crowder should still be able to see a good number of looks in this game. And speaking of the slot, the last player that I want to mention at wide receiver on the positive end is Randall Cobb. The Texans are facing the Jags this week, and Jacksonville has seen the second highest target rate to the slot this season. That's where Cobb, according to Pro Football Focus, has played 83% of his snaps. And Cobb's been relatively involved in this Texans offense this year. After his week 1 game where he had a sub 10% target share, he's hit about a 15% share in each of his last 3 games. So I like him more as a desperation play this week. Let's talk about Jarvis Landry. He's got an 18.3% target share this season. Not amazing, but I guess it's not terrible. He just hasn't done a whole lot aside from throw a dime to Odell Beckham. He only has 5 deep ball targets. And if not for that passing touchdown last week, he'd rank 36th or worse in weekly wide receiver scoring every single week this year. Now he gets a Colts defense that's been 3rd best in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. I'm just not feeling him this week. The same goes for T.Y. Hilton. I don't know how you can confidently put Hilton in the top 30, which is where he is right now, when he hasn't finished a game that high since the middle of the 2019 season. I talked about this on the 10 Trends show, but I wanted it to be noted that he's still being ranked really high when everything suggests that he shouldn't be. If he goes off on your bench, great. At least you know he's capable. But I would play guys like John Brown and Russell Gage and Jamison Crowder and Laviska Shenault, barring injury, over T.Y. Hilton this week. So I mentioned Eric Ebron last week. His game wasn't played, but I do like him this week as a streamer. He's seen his target share rise in each game this season up to a 20% target share in week 3, and he gets an Eagles defense this week that's been very bad against tight ends this year. We had Kittle last week against them. We had the big Tyler Higbee game against them. Logan Thomas was a tight end 7 in week 1 against Philadelphia. Ebron works as a streamer with touchdown upside. But if you want to dig deeper than Ebron, Ian Thomas kind of works. I say kind of because you've really got to be desperate to use him, but I do think he's a deep play. The Falcons have been the absolute worst team at defending tight ends this year according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. We saw what Robert Tonyan did to them last week. And to reiterate what I said about Bridgewater earlier, this is a fun scoring environment. This game could see a lot of points. Like Ebron, we've seen Thomas start to get a little bit more involved in that offense where he hit a season-high 14% target share last week. And according to PFF, Thomas has also been running a reasonable number of routes. He has 25 the last 2 weeks. So I think the matchup and his slight uptick in usage makes him a sleeper this week. On defense, you've got to use the Arizona Cardinals against Joe Flacco. Basic process shows us that. The Cardinals are 7-point favorites. There's a 46.5 point over-under, which is low these days. And the Jets rank 3rd worst in pressure rate allowed this year. They're a strong play this week, the Arizona Cardinals defense. And then you could also go with the Dallas Cowboys. I know I mentioned Houston on the 15 Transaction show this week, but I think that I like Dallas more, even though the defense is terrible. Daniel Jones is a turnover machine, and the Giants have allowed pressures at a top 10 rate in the league. The Cowboys are not in a bad spot this week as big favorites. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. One more episode this week, the mailbag episode, and that drops tomorrow morning.